Thank you very much to the organisers, first of all, for inviting me. I'm very honoured to be here today. I'm going to talk about multilingualism, identity, mindsets, language, rights, but I'm going to focus on children. And I'm going to focus on children being bilingual, on children becoming multilingual, integrating new communities, acquiring new languages, and a new self in a safe and positive learning environment. That's what we actually want to encourage education contexts to become. So how can education create friendly spaces and give children the gift of multilingualism and the gift of maintaining their language identities? And our question is, are we actually doing that now or not? There seem to be some positive areas where multilingualism is actually being encouraged. And if you look at the key competences for lifelong learning that were revised between 2016 and 2018 by the EU, they started off with language separation. So first you have communication in the mother tongue, and the second competence was communication in foreign languages. But when we looked at that, we obviously realized that they did not reflect the reality and how children actually function in multilingual societies today. So the new revised version looks like this. And it is very interesting to see that one of the competences has become multilingual, a multilingual competence. And the other competence, the second one, is literacy. So there is a focus on recognizing, acknowledging, and supporting children's multilingual repertoires, but also the important focus on literacy. Because when children come into school, and newly arrived children in particular contexts come into the school system, they have to learn to read and write in their multiple languages. And ideally, they will also learn to read and write in their mother tongue, so that they become multilingual and multiliterate in the languages that they know. There also seems to be some kind of positive attitudes in the newspapers. So this is a research that was conducted in Brussels with about 4,200 primary school children, and we found out that that children actually speak more than one language at home. About 50% of children speak more than one language at home. If you add the local languages, if you add the school languages, these children are multilingual. And the discourse in this particular article is actually quite positive. It encourages us to leave the monolinguistic vision behind. Here is another example where the title is quite positive. So children who speak English as a second language are more likely to improve in primary school. However, when you look inside, there are some actually interesting sentences that I like to focus on. And this is the first one. Some very bright children come to this country or are born to immigrants. And I thought, only some? Are children born to immigrants not bright? So, and I thought that was a little bit patronizing, being the daughter of immigrants myself. Another one. The title, the headline, looks quite positive. So statewide tests, so ELLs, English language learners in the United States, they're doing quite well in their statewide tests. However, let's look inside again. And the first sentence, it's a surprising finding. Why is it still surprising today that children who are learning a new language and picking up a new language are actually capable of learning that language and excelling at it? I think it's because we are still looking at children and we are still looking at education through the monolingual mindset. Therefore, we are incapable of acknowledging the potential that multilingualism actually gives society and these children. Sometimes the discourse is downright negative. And this is an interesting, another newspaper article, 2014, this is the 21st century. in Luxembourg, an officially multilingual country, where the children are being punished for speaking their mother tongue. And this isn't just children, these are 3- and 4-year-olds in kindergarten. And this is the language this is their emotional language, is their affective language. It's the language is their bedside story language. It's the language that they are comforted in when they are sick, when they fall and hurt themselves. So I think today, despite the fact that we accept that multilingualism is a fact, it's the norm, the discourse is still through the monolingual lens. And therefore, children's languages are at best ignored, still, and at worst, explicitly discriminated against, as in this example. So we need to move towards a multilingual mindset, and these phrases are actually very interesting in how they describe monolingualism as the illiteracy of the 21st century, an affliction of the powerful, the real linguistic deficiency, a figment of the imagination, a myth detached from reality because the reality on the ground is multilingual, and a waste of our biological linguistic potential. I'd like to add an invisibility cloak, because I think that we are not looking at multilinguals, and especially multilingual children, as multilingual individuals. We're looking at them through the monolingual lens, because the monolingual approach and bias that we still function with in society is actually blocking our vision and is blocking the way that we should be functioning, and we should be helping these children develop their multilingualism and therefore their multilingual identity as well. But why is this? I mean, multilingualism is a challenge. It is not easy because it's also messy. And I suppose in a bit more academic language, it is a complex, dynamic, and multidimensional phenomenon. It includes all of these elements, and it's fuzzy because they interact with each other, they interlinked, they impact on each other. So if we move from, I just wanted to give an example from my own personal experience, and it is actually a personal anecdote of how multilingualism actually functions in reality. And this was my father's 70th birthday. We were in Paris in a Portuguese restaurant, and we were having lunch using 4 different languages, because there are 4 different languages in the family. So I'd just like to show you how this conversation went. Whoops, sorry, I'm going back. So my parents speak Portuguese, and we always speak Portuguese to them. So he says about his veal, his roast veal, "A vitela assada está muito boa." He liked it. So I turned to my husband, and we speak English all the time. So my dad likes the vitela, what do you think? And he agrees, it's really good. He turns around to my brother-in-law, that they are both Arabic speakers. So in Arabic, they say to each other, "El bitelo helwa." Aywa, my brother-in-law agrees. My brother-in-law and my sister speak French at home. So they turn to each other and speak French. "Oh, tu veux goûter le veau? C'est très bon ici." And then my sister turns to my mother. "Posso provar a vitela?" Because that's always the language we've spoken to our parents. I turn to my son. That's the language we use at home with him. "Karim, do you also want some vitela?" Always switching. And it's important that the word vitela always appears in Portuguese, because my mother was the cook in the house. And language around food and cooking is very Portuguese. So he turns around, switching between English and French, as he does all the time. "No, c'est bon, my steak frites fine." Now, I wouldn't have written this down if the waitress, who was actually looking at us and very strangely, suddenly mustered the courage to ask us, "So, vocês estão a falar quantas línguas? How many languages are you speaking?" So we were speaking 4 languages, having a perfectly normal conversation. We were not translating either. We were actually just translanguaging. So that's how multilingual communication functions. And in this particular case, we are actually foregrounding our multilingual identity by being able to use these 4 languages in this particular context. So we need to deconstruct multilingualism, and I think we need to demonolingualize discourse so that we instinctively talk about plurality and diversity, and that our discourse becomes more inclusive. We need to demonolingualize perspectives so that we develop a more holistic view of multilingualism and we treat individuals as multilinguals from the onset. We need to demonolingualize language so that we stop objectifying language into separate boxes and separate entities. We need to demonolingualize education and include translanguaging and multilanguaging as inherent classroom practices and therefore enhance deeper learning and help teachers understand these different strategies. We need to demonolingualize the self. The inner self, who I am as a multilingual, the outer self, how I present myself as a multilingual. And I think we need to talk more about multilingualism in schools. I don't think we do enough of that. We need to make our multilingualism visible, and we need to be proud of our multilingual identity. There is a call for the multilingual turn, which recognizes multilingualism as the norm, which recognizes multilingual repertoires and the fact that we are living in super diverse societies, and it also recognizes how languages develop over our own histories, in that languages sometimes develop with us, sometimes we leave languages behind us. So multilingualism isn't something that is, it's not linear as we would like it to be. But we need to add identity to the multilingual turn, because multilingualism, using children's different languages in an educational context, should not just be a scaffolding approach. Right, I need to help this child learn that language. I'm going to use a word from Estonian just to help them learn the language. It should be about acknowledging their plurilingual identities. It should be about contributing to their social, emotional, and well-being, and as a recognition of their children's agency in how they prefer to learn and in the languages that they would like to learn, they would like to use in order to help them learn. We are not giving them these choices in education. Identity is also about negotiating. It's about negotiating who you are at that particular moment in time. Because as Bonnie Norton states, languages, the role of language as constitutive of and as constituted by language learners' social identity is an important aspect to remember. I'm sitting in front of you speaking English. I was introduced as an associate professor of English subject pedagogy. I have met one of my colleagues from my previous work at the British Council, and yet you may have discovered that my mother tongue is Portuguese. So perhaps I'm foregrounding my Englishness, but there is more to me than just that. The work that I have done with children on language and identity, or multilingualism and identity, has shown me that the links, the connections that children make to their languages depend on the people who speak the languages to them, the places where these languages are used, and also the experiences that children have in these languages. So the question should be, are we speaking our languages to our children? What are the spaces that we are creating for language use and language interaction to exist? And what experiences are we giving our children in those different languages for them to connect to the language? The interesting thing is, though, that even though children were very clear about who I speak that language to, so I speak Russian to my father and French to my mother, when you ask them to explain, you actually realize that their communication was actually a lot more multilingual than that. They may be speaking French to their mother and then switch to English. So there's always this pull between needing to be identified as a French speaker because I can speak French, I'd like to be seen as a French speaker, but at the same time wanting to be given the opportunity to also be multilingual when I have to be multilingual, when I need to switch between languages. So the pull between this physical, unique, negotiating between a physical and unique space, language space, and then a much more overlapping and complex language space. Children are constantly moving between the two. There's also some very interesting work being done at Cambridge University through a project called MATE, so Multilingualism, Engaging Individuals, Transforming Societies in the UK, where they're looking at conceptualizing multilingual identity as participative. You need to participate in the language, in developing that identity in order to develop that multilingual mindset. And the words that I find interesting in this quote are explicit, participative, active, conscious. So it needs to become visible in order for it to become possible. And I'd just like you, there's also a very interesting work being done on visualizing multilingual lives or visualizing multilingualism, or calling for a visual turn in research in multilingualism. So you actually get participants in research to draw their languages as opposed to just talk about their languages. I would like to call for a visual turn in pedagogy as well, in order for us to get children involved in drawing and expressing their languages through multiple creative means, as opposed to just talking about their languages. And I'd like to show you some examples of work that we've done with children around this visualizing multilingual identity. But before we even go there, you, as the educator, as the parent, as the teacher, you need to expose yourself. You need to be multilingual, and you need to be proud of being multilingual, and tell the children, tell your students that you are multilingual. And that's me. That's me being multilingual. All the different connections I have with my languages, the languages I've learned, the organizations I've worked for. My very latest is the Very Hungry Caterpillar in Norwegian, because I am now trying to learn Norwegian. Now, when I work with teachers and I do a session on multilingualism, this is what I show them, this is who I am. And the interesting thing is that teachers went away and did the same thing. So on the right, this is a language map. So we had worked with language maps in our professional development course, and the teacher went away, she drew her own language map, and you can see all the different languages that she's got on there. And then she presented this language map to her grade 7 class, so 12-year-olds. And they produced their own language maps. Now you can see that there's a kind of a mirror image of the teacher's language map. But the children were actually quite positive about this experience, because they were able to describe and talk about and express this language identity through visual means. And I particularly like this one because this language journey does not end. The child says, "To be continued." And I think that is absolutely wonderful that this child intends to learn more languages. Multilingual repertoires. We need to put this on the table literally. And this is what we did. We looked at, okay, what languages do you know? Not necessarily just the language that you speak or read and write, but the ones you know. And then we were playing around with our languages. Okay, which are our dominant language what is our dominant language constellation? That is, the languages that I use on a regular basis, that perhaps I need to use in this particular context. And here you've got mine and a teacher's. And then you're able to have discussions about why these choices are made. Another example that some of you may know is the language silhouette. And these language silhouettes are actually brilliant because they don't just talk about your history, they really do go deep down into how you experience language emotionally, so therefore your language identity. And this one was particularly amazing because this child drew the inner organs of her body. So language is visceral. It is something that is connected to her even physiologically. And these are some of the comments that she wrote about her different languages. I'm not going to read them all. I'm just going to bring them up on the slide. But the one thing that I actually found really interesting about these comments is the metaphor, the metaphorical language that the child is using. This was a research I did with 14-year-olds. And so how the child is actually trying to express this identity through metaphor. Another example is objects. I've also used objects quite a lot because objects connect people to their experiences. And it is interesting that they don't just connect people to the actual cultural space that objects are supposed to come from. So if we use this example on the screen, you would, I think, inevitably associate these two objects with the Middle East, am I right? Well, the child who actually chose these two objects was a Spanish, French, and English speaker. So can you connect these objects to one of those languages? Oops, going back. No, English. Simply because this child learned English in an international kindergarten in Dubai. And it was the child's connection to English will forever be the desert and camels and this part of the world, not the green moors of England. So that's how these objects, they give you the opportunity of decentering the whole language discourse and looking at the reality of how children use their languages. Just one more example. This is a school in Ireland, and fantastic work that a head teacher, Deirdre Cohen, did in the school, where she opened up the language space to multiple languages. And this includes English and Irish, but also the children's heritage language. And in this example, you've got the child writing the same text in English, Irish, and Hungarian, her heritage language. So even at literacy level, once you open up the school system to languages, the children also were learning each other's languages through poems and songs, etc. So, in order to develop a multilingual identity mindset, we can do that by making children's languages and plurilingual skills visible, by including discussion around children's languages and language use in the classroom, acknowledging children's language repertoires as a positive contribution to language learning, developing children's awareness of languages, of other languages in the classroom, and therefore opening up an intercultural discussion around language. Sustaining and validating children's multilingual identity, exploring language connections, differences, similarities, roots, families, and teaching multilingual strategies, such as language modes, translanguaging, multilanguaging, metalinguistic and pragmatic awareness, so that children can learn to be plurilingual. And I just want to finish with this drawing, because I think it's actually a wonderful drawing from a 13-year-old in my research. She wrote her 5 languages in the actual script. She on the side, so I love you, in her different 5 languages. She also expresses what her languages are for her. They are my confidence, my proudness, my pride, achievement, my difference from other, my power. And I think the most important thing is that this power is visible in her drawing because she's actually holding the world in her hand. So it is by giving children a multilingual voice that we acknowledge their multilingual identity and we give them a multilingual power. Thank you. Aikos.